Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 12th webinar session for Research Skills for Library Liaison. My name's Sandy Ray from Griffith University. I shall be the moderator today. I also have Sue Hickson from Griffith University and the convener of the Learning Information Services Working Party to help facilitate today's session. We're also joined by Jackie Wolstenholme from James Cook University, the convener of the Research Support Working Party. So, before we begin today's session, let's just run through some housekeeping rules. Please remember the session is being recorded and you can turn off the video. That can slow your system down a bit. You can use your microphone to talk. You just need to raise your hand when you want to talk. Click on the talk button to speak and then click the talk button again when you finish speaking. And use the chat window to ask any questions and give comments. No private chats, just keep it friendly, professional and productive. Now just looking at the panel on the left for some of the Collaborate tools. You'll see under your name there'll be a smiley face, a person, a hand and a tick. Could everyone just give me a tick, the last one, just to see that everything's good, that everyone can use those tools, everyone's quite happy with that? That's great. Okay, thank you everyone for that. So you can use any of those icons as we go through today to show how you're feeling, give us a smiley face or things like that, or if you're taking a break or you want to raise your hand. I shall be monitoring the chat window underneath, so please feel free to type any questions in as we go along, and we'll address those when we come to the question and answer parts of the session. I can also ask if anyone's logging in as a group, could you just give an indication of the numbers in that group so that we can just get some numbers for today. And now I'll pass you over to Sue to introduce the presenter.
Thank you, Sandy. Today we're cracking the code, Librarians and the Responsible Conduct of Research. And we're lucky enough today for our very last, but certainly not least session, Dr. Sue O'Brien, who's the Research Integrity Manager, Office of the Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Research and Innovation at the University of Queensland. Her role is to actively promote responsible conduct of research across the university, as well as receiving potential complaints of research misconduct and managing associated investigations. Sue started her varied career as a postdoc with CSIRO. For 5.5 years, she developed and managed the National Research Program for the Leukemia Foundation Australia, followed by 12 months in the UQ School of Medicine, setting up an NHMRC Centre of Research Excellence, before being appointed to the role of Manager of Sponsored Health and Biomedical Initiatives team in the Research Management Office. Quite a big mouthful there. From there she was recruited to the integrity role. She has a Bachelor of Science with Honours and a PhD in Plant Reproductive Biology from the University of Melbourne. So welcome Sue, and take it away.
All right, thank you very much Sue. Thank you everybody for joining us today. I'm been invited to speak to you as librarians about how your roles would interact regularly, or yeah, maybe often, maybe not so often, with researchers in terms of the responsible conduct of research. So what I'm going to do is I'll do the talk kind of in 3 sections. So the first section we're just looking at the context of why research integrity is such a high-profile issue in current times, and I don't think that that's going to go away either. And then I'm going to ask you a few questions, get some information from you guys about any your thoughts on a particular question I've got. Then I'll lead you through the 8 parts of the code, and which is really the behaviours that we should have, or that we hope researchers will have. And then I'll look at what institutions are required to do if there is the possible case of research misconduct. And along the way, we'll just play it a little bit by ear, whether I answer questions along the way or whether I'll break it at the 3 points. So that might be an opportunity for questions to be asked. So just to get going then, I thought that it would be interesting to throw it open to you guys just to get started so that I can think about emphasis as I'm talking. would anyone like to share any questions that have arisen in relation to research integrity in your interactions as librarians with researchers? What kinds of questions arise, or what questions occur to you when you're listening to researchers' questions about the different services that you provide in terms of understanding, in terms of, asking for literature, asking about data management, and those sorts of questions. So now I'm not sure, Sue, will somebody type those questions for me, or will people speak to them and you'll type them anyway?
So everyone can type into the chat screen.
Okay.
So if they put it into the chat screen, Sandy will read them out, or you can read them out. It just depends on how we go.
Okay.
And people can choose to talk. We'll just unmute them and they can talk. So either way is
good.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Well, there aren't any questions there at the moment. No, we do have a question. So the first question is, do academics need to have ethics approval for collecting data from students and to share what they've been doing in their teaching? Okay, this is a question which does come into my office on a semi-regular basis. So I'll give the answer for the University of Queensland, but I think it would probably apply across most universities. If an academic is doing a survey for the purposes of the quality of their teaching with their students, they don't usually require ethical approval for that because that is something they're going to apply straight into their research, whether their lectures were interesting, whether the content was appropriate, and so on. But sometimes academics will then come to me and they'll say, hey, I've realized that this is actually a really great data set. Can I use that to develop a research paper to present at a conference? If that's the case, generally speaking, you actually do need ethics approval, and the researcher would actually need that approval in advance of collecting the data. There might be an exception where they know they can go back to every single one of those students who listened to their class and then filled in the original survey form. They may have the opportunity to retrospectively gain approval, but generally speaking, it's simpler and easier to obtain that approval in advance.
Thanks, Sue. That was great. And maybe I can just ask a follow-up question if no one else wants to ask a question. So do we need ethics approval for all research on humans? And then following on from that, do we need ethics approval for research on all other animals and all plants?
Okay, firstly, with humans, I always say to people, if you are doing anything with humans, you must talk to your Human Research Ethics Committee. If you're doing a research project and it involves any sort of interaction with humans, you will need to get ethical approval. It may only be low risk approval. So for example, if we use the student lecture example, that would most likely be a low risk series of or a low risk approval you'd need, because the kinds of questions you're asking might be quite innocuous, but nonetheless you do need to make sure that the kinds of questions that you're asking and the way you're asking those questions is appropriate. Once anything gets any more complicated than that, generally it will require a full review by the Human Research Ethics Committee of the university or institution in which you work. So that's the answer for human ethics. The other aspect of human ethics is, for example, if it's a clinical trial or a clinical study of some kind, usually the researchers need to go to the dominant or the main hospital in which, or health service in which that research is being undertaken for the initial approval from a fully constituted HREC approved by the National Health and Medical Research Council. From there you will bring that approval into your own institution, and generally it would come in as what's called an expedited approval. So it depends upon the kinds of research that's being undertaken. If it's predominantly being undertaken or the subjects being collected through a health service or a hospital, you'd need to go to the Hospital Ethics Committee initially, then bring it into your university. With animals, you need ethics for every single thing you are going to do with animals. don't even think you can start animal research without ethical approval. Depending on the kinds of animals, the complexity of that approval or the protocol that you put in will be more or less great, depending on the kinds of experiments you want to do. We were talking before the session about, say, jellyfish versus fish versus whales. Pretty much we checked in with animal ethics here at UQ, and animals from sort of jellyfish upwards require ethical approval. Things like corals don't. The other thing that needs to be taken into account for your researchers is where that research is going to be taking place. So if they were working on koalas, they would need the appropriate Department of Environment, Heritage and Planning approvals here in Queensland or similar in other states. So it is very important that researchers get all of those things lined up. Also, there might be biosafety approvals that are required depending on what research is being undertaken. So, yeah, if people are aware that they've got to just make sure they've got ethical approval, appropriate site-specific permits, or permits to do particular work in their lab, that's very important. All right, so that's just got us started. The little cartoon, that was an issue which has actually arisen here at UQ this week, a bit of an authorship dispute about joint first authors. So we can maybe talk about that a little bit later on, but modern publishing creates all sorts of extra conundrums that didn't used to exist. So I thought I'd just start off with a few examples of recent and high-profile research misconduct, and I thought rather than pointing the finger at other institutions, it's better to just acknowledge that something has happened at my own institution. 2 years ago, you may be aware that the University of Queensland had to retract a paper from the European Journal of Neurology because we could find no primary data, no evidence of primary data collection. There was no ethical approval. There were no patients, so perhaps it didn't matter that there wasn't ethics. And after a full research misconduct inquiry, the Vice-Chancellor made the decision that UQ wanted to be transparent about this matter, and we made a press release without giving the details, but we did release the details about the paper that was being retracted and the reasons for that. And in a funny way, that actually did UQ, I wouldn't say it did us a favour as entirely, but it did mean that our university has undertaken a major review of research ethics, integrity and compliance, and we're gradually working through our policies and procedures and improving the way that we are managing research, responsible conduct of research and research misconduct matters, ethical matters, and communicating to our researchers. The Guardian earlier this year published a quite comprehensive and really interesting to read overview of a matter which some of you may have been aware of. Last year there was a Japanese scientist in collaboration with an American scientist who claimed that she had been able to trigger stem cell abilities in ordinary body cells that were not stem cells. So stem cells are cells which can develop into different sorts of tissues, and they're a bit of a holy grail, of course, in treating people with different diseases. But in fact, there was not that capacity, and that was a really big story in the scientific community. It was because the original paper had been very spectacular, and of course that meant the fall was equally spectacular, and sadly one of the institute directors actually took his own life because he felt that he was responsible for not having realized that the work undertaken in his institution was sound, and research misconduct can have really serious implications. Another one which you all maybe could tick the yes no box. Is everybody aware of Retraction Watch, the website Retraction Watch? Be interesting to see how many people know about that. Okay, about 6 of you are aware of Retraction Watch. If you just put Retraction Watch into Google, it's a website which is run by a couple of Americans. One is used to be a medical researcher and the other was a journalist, and together they've come together and developed this blog which is avidly read by researchers around the world. they've kind of taken it on themselves to, I think a bit like the Democrats used to, keep the bastards honest. They watch how journals are retracting publications, and they make comments on whether those are good retractions or bad retractions, so, or corrigenda, or any other comments in correcting some aspect of the record, the academic record of that paper. So they'll make a comment if they think that a retraction has been done given sufficient information so that researchers can understand, researchers who might rely on that paper can understand why the paper was retracted, what the reasons were. They'll kind of say, hey, this is a really good example, this journal's done a fantastic job, or this researcher's done a really good job in retracting their paper, depending whether it's been a voluntary retraction or a forced retraction. They'll also get stuck into journals where people haven't made good decisions about that. And I'm pleased to say that when UQ's retraction went forward 2 years ago, we got a really nice rap on Retraction Watch. So, you know, it was nice to get kind of positive international feedback that UQ had done the right thing, even though it wasn't a situation that we would have chosen to be in. This page that I've copied here is in regard to some research undertaken by Andrew Wakefield. If any of you have been sort of following the vaccination stories over the last almost 2 decades now, Andrew Wakefield was a researcher in the UK who published what turned out to be very spurious research linking autism and the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. It took, that original paper was published in 1998 and it wasn't retracted by the Lancet until 2010. And it was really retracted because the British Medical Journal did a lot of major investigation into the origins of the supposed research that had been published. And unfortunately it didn't really reflect very well on the Lancet because the journalist involved had tried to work with the Lancet on it, but they didn't want to know about it at the time. So there's a pretty interesting story there in the publishing world. This is just another excerpt from the ABC website a couple of years ago. The medical research community has uncovered a worrying trend. This story was actually not many weeks after the UQ retraction, and QUT, I don't know if there's anyone from QUT, had also had a similar problem around the same time as UQ. So you can see that last 2 sentences. 3 major Australian universities are currently investigating serious allegations of alleged research misconduct. So the media is very interested in this topic, and for good reason. The public image of research as a profession is critical. If people do the wrong thing in our institutions, it impacts on our own institution, it impacts on the research team that undertook that research, or the researchers around the person who undertook the research, which turned out to be dodgy in some way. And we need to always remind our researchers, and think about it ourselves too, because our jobs rely upon this. We're all basically funded through taxes or perhaps donations from not-for-profit groups or from private industry. And those people all rely upon us doing a really good job as researchers and as institutions. And research is what allows human progress. So we need to make sure it's really reliable. So today I just want to talk about some of the ways that you guys as librarians can contribute to that. This is a quote from Philip Campbell, the editor-in-chief of Nature, last year, speculating. A lot of people speculate, why is there an apparent increase in sloppy research, inaccurate research, or inaccurate data? Why is there an increase in retractions or corrigendums to publications? Nobody can really answer that question, I think, entirely. We can all speculate. It's possibly the requirement these days, well, the difficulty of getting a research grant. Even at UQ, which has some of the best outcomes in research grant applications in the country, we are only getting maybe 20% success rate. So that is a massive impost on researchers, and the pressure to obtain grants flows, I think, or the pressure to publish flows from the pressure to obtain grants, and maybe people cut corners. in attempting to achieve that. But we don't really know. The other thing is, of course, is that most universities now have research integrity officers, and the Australian Code was developed only in 2007. Maybe it's a flow through from that too, that people are just becoming more aware, both in Australia and around the world, and they know how to report matters. So perhaps the incidence hasn't particularly increased, but perhaps universities now have mechanisms in place to address it, and it's all coming to light. So I don't know what the actual answer is. But anyway, I thought I'd start off with a question for you all. Now, I don't do the ERA submission, so allow me a little bit of license if I haven't got this quite right. But of course, institutions have to prepare a lot of data for their ERA submissions. And one of those things is the number of publications in different kinds of journals, books, conferences, and they will get different scores and so on. So what if you were in charge of preparing that documentation for your institution on the publications? You put together a great big list, and as you're sorting it, you notice that there's quite a number of publications, or pairs of publications, or maybe triples of publications that have the same titles. What would you do? Now, we've set up, the moderators have set up so that you can actually vote. So I'll just read out each of the options. It's a little multiple choice. So what would you do? Would you delete the duplicate publications from the lowest ranked journal in every pair, as this will be more beneficial to your institution? Would you retain the earliest published version according to publication date and delete the more recent version? Would you retain some of the pairs of publications because the authors are actually different? Or would you make a file of the apparent duplications and contact your research integrity office for advice? So, would you all like to vote? Well, it looks like everybody's given what I consider is the right answer. Maybe I should have made the answers a little bit harder. I asked this question because it was only this year's ERA processes that I realized from one of our librarians that in fact we have this capacity. I think there's some software from the ARC that sent back a list to UQ with a whole lot of duplicates for the university to go and have a look at and work out, you know, had they got there accidentally because they'd pulled up in two different search engines, or the researcher had accidentally uploaded them twice, or they just happened to have the same title. And I have to say that I now actually have to spend some time with one of our librarians just having a look at those and determining the nature of those duplications. So this is an immediate area of interest, I think, for librarians. And I think once you're aware, it hadn't, and I say this with the greatest respect to our library staff, because as Faye, you know, and Amber, and who's not online, you know, we work together a lot. But I think this is why a seminar like this is really helpful, because it's looking for those cross-disciplinary connections, even for professional staff, that help us to see how we can work with others and how we can interact with their role. So I didn't know that the library had this capacity when ERA went up, and the librarian who showed it to me he kind of didn't know what to do with some of the questions, but now we know that we need to talk to each other. So that's one example. Has anyone had that issue in their university? Would anyone like to make a comment on that? Okay, I've got a question here in relation to this, and it says, can I ask what you advise academics when they use the same title for a conference presentation and then for the following journal article? Yeah, I wouldn't say that the title was actually a problem. The title in my scenario is the flag. So if a researcher makes a presentation at a conference, say my title here today, Cracking the Code, and then I decide I'm going to expand that into a full journal article. The qualifier, I think, would be what happened at the journal, at the conference in the first instance. So what was the academic or the formal output, I should say, from the conference? So were there proceedings that were published? of those proceedings. Were they just titles of the papers that were presented? Were they abstracts? Or were they short papers? If I then say it was just an abstract that I had presented and now I've expanded it to a full 10-page journal article, there probably wouldn't be a lot of overlap, because at the conference I would have just presented a small part of my research, just an overview, probably not much data. When I move to writing that paper up in full, if it was appropriate, I might refer to the presentation at the conference just to make sure that people know that I had previously presented it. But there's probably not a lot of overlap. It can become more problematic if somebody's presented at a conference which also results in a short paper published in the proceedings, so maybe say a 2- or 3-page paper, which this can be particularly problematic in the engineering disciplines, I've realized. In engineering, people tend to go to the big conferences. That's very important for their discipline. They often use that as a place to present their first outcomes of their findings. In the medical space, it's quite different. Researchers tend not to present at a conference until they know that their research has been accepted for publication in one of the journals. So it can be a bit discipline specific, but the important thing is if I've published a 3-page short paper on cracking the code and I've got some data in there, maybe a diagram, particular text, then I want to expand that out to my 10-page paper. I need to understand what the requirements are from the conference, what the copyright requirements of that conference are. I would certainly need to refer to that earlier publication if there was any overlap between my 10-page paper and my original 2- or 3-page paper. So I think it's a rule of thumb. You almost need to treat that short paper, think about it as if it was a paper produced by somebody else and treat it in the same way. If I want to refer to it, I need to refer to it using the same publishing conventions that I would if I was referring to something by, say, Faye or Jackie. That's my sort of general rule of thumb on that. But the same title in and of itself is not a problem, I don't think, as long as the content is different. How different do 2 papers need to be? I think the sort of rule of thumb is about 30%. I'm not sure. I think some journals actually give some figures, but academics that I've worked with here at UQ in the plagiarism or duplication space generally sort of put the line at around 25 to 30%. And even with that 20%, say, that is overlapping, you really ought to refer to the earlier work. It's always far better to recommend people to be cautious in this space, much better than having the finger pointed later on. Okay, so I'm going to just run through the code. Maybe again, could people tick yes or no if they've read the code? All right, so we've got approximately 7 people who've read the code, 2 people who haven't, and other people aren't admitting to either. That's fine. When I gave a research presentation yesterday at one of our institutes, and it was funny because I asked the question and about half the people put up their hand and said they had and half hadn't, and then the institute director said, he said, well, you've all signed that you have read it in your condition of contract, so that was quite funny. All right, so the Australian Code for Responsible Conduct of Research was first published in 2007. It's a joint document of the ARC, the National Health and Medical Research Council, and Universities Australia. And the code sits across all research in public institutions in Australia. It's a code. It's not legislated. So universities and research institutes are required to use it to guide the development of their own policies. It's a requirement, for example, of NHMRC and ARC grants that our institutions have policies and procedures which are compliant with the Australian Code. But there is some leeway there for interpretation. The code is actually currently undergoing review, so it will be interesting to see what final product comes out probably about mid next year, I'm guessing. The first consultation has gone out, and the draft is not being particularly well received, I don't think, around the country, so it may take a little bit more work for them to land something that everybody's happy with. Anyway, the code is divided into Part A and Part B, and Part A is the principles of encouraging responsible conduct of research, and it looks at both institutional and researcher responsibilities. Part B describes breaches of the code, gives definitions of research misconduct, and also provides a framework for resolving allegations. And I always say to our researchers, if you follow Part A, you don't need to know what's in Part B. That's really the best way to go. So Part A is divided into 8 sections, and I'll look briefly at each of those sections. The first of these is the general principles, and it's honesty and integrity, respect, good stewardship, professional courtesy and fairness, and responsible communication of results. I always say to researchers with respect to this, it's basically treat other people how you would like to be treated. If these 5 attributes are used in our work life, I guess even for us as professional staff, of course, and also for researchers, you pretty much have to assume that not too much would go wrong. Unfortunately, along the way, people can make genuine errors, and they can also make errors arising perhaps from poor attitudes towards other people. Something I'd like to refer you to is the Singapore Statement. The Singapore Statement is a really useful document that you might like to go and download. It arose out of the Second World Conference on Research Integrity, which was held, oddly enough, in Singapore. And it's a really nice one-page document. It's partly actually based on the Australian Code. You'll see that the headline principles are honesty, accountability, professional courtesy and fairness, and good stewardship. And then there's 14 points after that. And it's just a very nice one-page statement for good practice in research integrity. And it complies with, because it was produced at that conference, it's compliant with any other existing codes internationally, and certainly with the Australian Code. So that's quite a good thing if you wanted to perhaps have that on a library website, referring people to that, along with the Australian Code, of course, which has more detail. Part of the first section is ensuring that ethical and biosafety requirements are met, and we talked about those earlier. So people need to comply with the National Statement on Ethical Conduct in Human Research. They need to comply with the Australian Code for Care and Use of Animals, and they need to comply with biosafety or other permits like national parks permits and so on. If any of those things are not in place, and a researcher conducts their research, it would actually constitute research misconduct. So that's a really important point to know. So make sure that your researchers are aware that having these approvals in place is actually critical. They can't not have those things. It's not an optional extra to their research. Now this is for the librarians. I'll give you a moment to read this Dilbert cartoon. So I just like that because it was kind of particularly applicable, I guess, to some of the issues that we had here at UQ a couple of years ago. I didn't know data could be real. Hopefully that's mostly not the case. This, I think, is particularly pertinent to research librarians in our institutions. A lot of you, I imagine, like the librarians here at UQ, are starting to grapple with those issues of data storage. You're often the custodians of the repositories, and I'm not sure how other institutions are going, but UQ is trying to work out what we currently have a research data management policy, but we don't actually have a procedure because at this stage the university hasn't got the infrastructure completely in place. So it's a bit difficult to say to people you must do this when in fact we can't necessarily support them in all of that. But the important thing about research data for researchers is, one, that they do need to retain it and primary materials, so that might be DNA, RNA, it could be historical items, it could be rocks in the case of geologists. I had the geologists here say to me, we've got a problem, we don't know where to store all our rocks. And I thought, I don't either. But they used to be able to give them to the museum, I gather, here in Queensland, but I think the museum stopped receiving that kind of material. They're probably running out of storage space as well. It's very important to manage the storage of that data, so you can imagine as computer systems upgrade and so on, maintaining the quality of access to original data can become challenging too. Confidentiality is very important, particularly obviously in research that involves human subjects, and that could be, social science research, could be medical research. The minimum retention period of research data and primary materials is 5 years from the publication of the work. So I always say that to researchers. It's not from when you got the grant, it's not from when you submitted your thesis, it's actually from when you publish your work, and you might produce 4 or 5 papers out of a research grant, so it'll be 5 years from the last paper that gets published. And with clinical trials it's longer, it's 15 years, because obviously that could have significant impact on human health. It's really important that researchers retain their data, and of course now with open access requirements that all changes yet again, and I am not completely across that, so if anybody asks me any complicated questions about that, I may have to refer it to Faye or Jackie perhaps to answer from their institution's perspective. I think it's very important to help particularly research higher degree students who are just starting out to understand how they should retain their research data, maintain their lab books, make sure that their data sets are properly labeled, that they've got a data dictionary, because you know yourself, sometimes you go back to a file that you prepared a year ago and you're looking at going, what column, what do they mean by that column? And you can imagine for researchers with very complex data sets, if they don't label those data sets properly, the value of that data set would reduce significantly. I've put the link here to the University of Queensland Research Data Management page, which is operated by our library. It's a really great guide, and I refer students and researchers to this. And if you haven't had a look at it, or your own institution thinking about what you should do or how you can connect better to researchers, you might want to have a look at the UQ Library Guide, because it does offer well, one good model anyway to get these things started. Responsibility as a supervisor is addressed in the code. Research supervisors are required to make sure that their teams are trained in discipline-based methodology, that guidance is given at all stages of a research project, which can be from writing a grant, submitting an ethics approval, designing experiments appropriately, collecting the data, reporting and publishing that data. It's incumbent on them to teach their students or their postdocs how to collect valid and accurate research data, and then of course store that data. And it's also incumbent on supervisors to make sure that their trainees are given appropriate credit for their work. So you don't get to be first author on your PhD students' research, of course. But I always emphasize to students as well that they likewise have an equal responsibility. They must undertake whatever induction is required of them or training, and it's important for them to seek guidance if they're not sure of what they should do. And I think that's really important, and you might come across students with questions in this space. Has anybody, I just wonder if anybody has had students come to them, or in the course of having a conversation about library services, a student has perhaps indicated that they're not sure if they're getting proper help from their supervisor. If anybody wants to write up a question about that. I think there's at least one question. I know, just going back to our earlier discussion about ERA, and Annette from Bond has said that, quite rightly, that on the ERA list, papers have to be peer reviewed, they've got to be in a journal on the ERA journal list, and that may well help us separate out the papers that can be accepted from ones that cannot. And that's an excellent point. The other thing, though, that I just comment about that is that, say someone had published a proper peer-reviewed journal article and had then gone on to perhaps publish something in a newsletter. Maybe I'll phrase that again. If somebody, somebody could still get a duplicate publication. It might not be in the formal recognized sense, but it's important, no matter what people publish or where they publish, that they still take into account those rules of whether something's been previously published. So if somebody published a journal article and then went on to write a newsletter article and it was based verbatim on their earlier article and they didn't reference that, that still wouldn't be good academic practice. The other thing is that if you use somebody else's article to write that newsletter and you copied things verbatim and presented it as if you'd written it yourself, that would still be plagiarism. It may not be quite as serious as if you'd plagiarized in Nature or the British Medical Journal, but yeah, it can be quite a fraught area.
So could I, it's Jackie here, could I just say, is that what we refer to as self-plagiarism, at least at JCU? And an example that we have is that two people were writing a blog, and then one of those people included information from their blog in their PhD thesis, and then that became an issue of integrity or copyright because it wasn't clear who'd written the content in the original blog, and the second author actually felt it was partly their work.
That's a really great example. And it's really important to let people know that their blogs count as publications. Maybe they don't count in an ERA context, but they still count, in terms of copyright. So if somebody's written the blog or contributed equally to the blog and then the other person used that in their thesis and didn't properly attribute the other person's work, that would be a problem for the thesis for sure. Somebody, Keisha from Western Sydney, has said that we should or the librarians need to let them know who their faculty representative for research is if they aren't sure how to approach their supervisor, which is excellent advice. So publication is dealt with in the code. It's important researchers need to publish a full account of their research, ensure accuracy, cite others correctly, no duplication or public plagiarism. So duplication is when people basically plagiarize themselves. You still have to quote yourself as if you were somebody else. That paper needs to stand as its own work. You can't just republish it, well, in my words. You've still got to say where it came from because you can't get credit for the same thing twice. It's okay to quote yourself, of course, but you must, or researchers need to know that they have to treat it as if they're quoting somebody else. Funding sources are important in publications as well, and that's a good thing to remind researchers because most funding agencies want acknowledgement. And certainly NHMRC and ARC, National Breast Cancer Foundation, some of those big ones definitely want that kind of thing. And also a lot of the smaller funding agencies too. Yeah, take into account proper details about clinical trials and confidentiality. Authorship is very fraught. I'm sure you've all had questions about who should be an author. The rules based, or the guidelines based on the code and things like the International Journal of International Medical, I won't be able to get it, ICMJE, the International Council of Medical Journal Editors, pretty much have the same guidelines. So all authors should be included. The author order should reflect contribution. No unacceptable inclusions of authorship should occur. And the contributions of others should be properly acknowledged. And there we've got the point about authorship being extended to web-based publications, including acknowledgement of authorship there. And it's good for researchers. Encourage them to just maintain a record of acknowledgements of authorship of publications. Lab heads don't always get to be an author. Supervisors don't always get to be an author. Often they are for very, very good reasons, but it's not a criteria as such. This is a definition of author from many sources, including the Australian Code. Contribution to at least one, and usually more than one of the following: conception and design, analysis and interpretation, substantial drafting, and critical revising. It's very important for researchers to think, and I think this is something to be aware of, if somebody walked past their lab and they said, "Oh, would you like to be an author on this paper?" It's really important for researchers to think about taking credit for work that they may not have done or for work that they don't fully understand. Sometimes if something goes wrong with the paper, they can be stuck with egg on their face because they maybe didn't contribute to it, and if the paper's retracted, their name is on that paper too. So encourage people to take full ownership of anything that they're going to be an author on. Peer review, not so much in the librarian space. I don't think we just encourage researchers to participate and to declare any conflicts and to undertake this with integrity. Conflicts of interest is the same. They can be actual, perceived, or potential, and can affect the choice of examiner, how peer review is undertaken, how people are appointed to their roles, and so on. Probably doesn't fall into your particular daily lives, I don't think, but it's good to be aware of it. And collaboration is another issue raised by the code, but basically researchers just need to collaborate in a way that's collegial and obeys their multi-institutional agreements. So that's part A. I'm aware of time. Does anyone have any questions particularly on part A, or shall I continue to do an overview of part B, which won't take very long, and then we can have questions at the end? What would you think, Sue or Jackie?
If someone's got a burning question, go for it right now, but
okay.
Otherwise I think we'll continue on.
Sure. Okay, so part B describes breaches of the code and how we would resolve research misconduct. So I'm not going to talk in detail because every institution will have some variation on this, but these are basically research misconduct that the code says don't go there. So people shouldn't make things up. They shouldn't fudge their results. They shouldn't copy other people's work. They shouldn't copy themselves. They shouldn't put other people, animals, or the environment at risk. And they shouldn't do research on humans or animals without ethics. Authorship. Research misconduct can include including other people without their permission. So putting someone on a paper because maybe, I don't know, they're a senior person and it might look good. Don't include people who don't qualify as an author on your paper. So don't give gift or ghost or guest authorship. And don't omit people who should be authors. So don't exclude someone because you had a falling out with them. If they've contributed to that research, you still need to find a way to get over your personal differences and make sure that they're properly recognised. And that's really, we have probably some of our most bitter problems in the authorship space. It's quite sad. So I think if we encourage people to talk, I think that's the thing with authorship. Encourage groups to constantly talk and constantly reflect and keep doors open. We'd go a long way to resolving a lot of authorship disputes. Researchers need to disclose their conflicts of interest that can actually constitute research misconduct. They shouldn't falsify or misrepresent themselves to funding agencies, for example, or to journals. And this is also important. If someone is aware that research misconduct may have occurred, they actually have an obligation to report it to the appropriate person in their institution. So any of those lists on those two slides can constitute research misconduct. What it doesn't include is honest errors or honest differences in interpretation or judgment of data. And no claims of misconduct against other people should be made that are gossip or deliberately fabricated. And this could result in allegations of misconduct against a mischievous claimant. Here at UQ we have had some claims that probably were mischievous but maybe not severe enough for us to actually pursue it in that way. But people do need to be very careful when they're reporting, and if they have a genuine concern, they should still report it, but you do need to remind them that they shouldn't, so if someone came to you and said, actually, I think this is plagiarized, what do you think? And you looked at it and you said, yeah, look, it does look like it's the same text. Encourage them to report it appropriately, their institution, and really encourage them not to then go and gossip about it, because until that's actually tested and taken through the processes, obviously people's reputations are very, hang in a very fine balance in this space in institutions. So we need to encourage people to be sensible in how they manage that, but make sure that they tell somebody as well, and tell someone that they know will actually deal with the issue. Maybe just another quick yes, no. How many of you know if your institutions have research integrity advisors? I'm not talking about a research integrity office, but research integrity advisors. Okay, under the code, integrity advisors are, I don't even say they're a requirement, but they're certainly recommended. They should be people who are very experienced researchers who can provide advice to people about matters of research, potential research misconduct, or just concerns. So again, talking about authorship or data management, someone doesn't quite know how to broach the subject of authorship. Maybe they are concerned about who should have access to their data. A research integrity advisor is a great first stop. So find out if your institution has integrity advisors, find out who they are, and then if a researcher comes to you, you can say, here's the list of integrity advisors on this website, and encourage them to go and talk to them. Integrity advisors, certainly at UQ, are not obliged, or in fact, they're not supposed to assess or investigate the allegations. They have to keep the concern confidential, and they don't contact the person who's the subject of the allegation or concern. They may well have to tell the Research Integrity Office. And so I think that's really important for you guys to find out who your integrity advisors are. This is the Research Integrity website at the University of Queensland. I'm just simply putting it there. You're welcome to come and have a look at our website, but see if your own institution has a similar website. Just know where it is. You might even want to put a link to it on your own library page, perhaps. And finally, I was thinking, how does this all relate to librarians? And we can have a bit of a discussion about that. I think it's really important to know the code. You don't have to know it in detail, but to know about the code, to know broadly what it covers so that you can guide researchers, even tell researchers, have you looked at the code? Maybe they don't know about it. Surprising number don't really. You should know your own institutional policies in relation to responsible conduct of research or integrity, code of conduct, that kind of thing. Know who manages research integrity or misconduct investigations at your institution. Following on from that, know to who you should refer researchers for help, and maybe even be aware of the educational opportunities for researchers at your institution, so that again you can say, hey, have you thought about doing this course in data management? Like our library runs a course for researchers in data management, for example. So, or there might be ethics courses that can be undertaken. So I think, yeah, if you guys just think about those 5 questions, you'd actually be really well equipped to provide immediate assistance to your researchers. It doesn't matter if you don't know all the answers. The important thing is to be able to direct people to someone who can help them. So that's the end of my formal presentation, and I'm very happy to take any questions from you.
So I'll ask a question while we wait for others to maybe ask a question. So thinking about the duplication or self-plagiarism issue, I had one researcher who's actually he's calling himself a post-career PhD student, and so he's written quite a lot, and it's often been informal reports for his previous employer and things like that, and he's finding now in writing his PhD that he is wanting to make statements that he's said many times before, and so he's not sure. He's happy to cite himself, but he's worried that his paper is going to just have his own name scattered, you know, in every single paragraph.
Yes. Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? And you could then be accused of, what's the word, trying to increase your citation rate.
Yeah, yeah.
You do hear about researchers who, you know, constantly work to cite their own work, or get into little cartels with other researchers where they all agree to cite each other's papers.
Yeah, look, I suggested to him maybe he needs to write a small paragraph or an opening sentence saying that this work was based on, and, you know, have an overview statement like that. How does that sound?
I think it depends on how he's, to use the word, duplicating his previous research or previous writings. Because you could have that in an opening statement, but then you wouldn't want the content to be a direct copy, because, for example, still turn up in something like Turnitin as a duplication. So I think that it's quite tricky, but I guess he wants to use his previous work, so how different is his new work to his previous work? And I guess that's the other question he needs to ask himself. What is new that he's adding to his discipline, his field, by producing this paper, if it's just a rehash of older works? That's one question.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
I don't know if
I just thought I'd ask. Yeah, no, it's great. I thought it would just help others to think through some issues they might come across as well. And Graham's making some discoveries on his website, which is great.
Good.
So, do we have one last question? Maybe we'll wrap up then. We've just got a couple of minutes to go. Sue, did you want to close the session? The other Jackie is just asking something now. Oh, okay, great.
I think we have Antoinette from Bond just typing something in as well, so we'll wait for that. Okay, just lots of thank yous, so that's good. So I'll add my thanks to that then, Sue. Thank you very much for the session. Sandy's just put up the SurveyMonkey link, so if everyone could take the time to give us some feedback on today's session, but also on all of the sessions that you've been able to be part of. So thank you very much. So big thank you to Sue. If everyone could show their appreciation under your little smiley face, there's an applause, or there's a smiley face, or whatever you feel like putting in there. So thank you very much, Sue. And I'd like to just say that, you know, thank you to Jackie for setting up these webinars. They've been really interesting to be part of and interesting to listen to. So I'd like to say thank you, and I'll hand over to Jackie now to close.
Thanks, Sue. Sue Hickson and Sue O'Brien, thank you very much. That was a great presentation, and it's a sticky topic that we all need to know about, and so I'm really pleased that you're able to share your expertise there. And so I'm just following on from Sue's comment about the surveys. We'll please fill in the survey, just a quick one that Sandy's posted there, but we'll also be sending out a larger survey for feedback on the overall webinar series, because that feedback's really important for us to look at what future events we might like to organise through QLOC, and we definitely need your input to make sure we're reaching what it is you need to know. So please fill in the surveys, and thanks to everyone for attending. And I guess the last thing to say is that we'll also list a link to all of the webinars on the QLOC website, and so we'll be sending out an email about that soon. And Keisha and Graham and anyone else who maybe isn't from a QLOC University Library, just send me an email if you'd like to know where that link is, and I'll follow up with you. So thanks everyone, and thanks again, Sue.